Hey folks, we are coming up on our 100th episode very soon. 100 episodes of Socialist Shelf. Nobody asked for it, and yet we are doing it. We will give you 100. We'll give you 10 hundred thousands, millions actually. But for the 100th episode, we were thinking it would be cool if we got some feedback from some of y'all. We always love feedback. We get it fairly often, not time to time, but if you have any questions for any of us, anything you want us to talk about, any comments, anything you want to say about the show that's, moderately nice at least, anything you want to throw out there here read on the air, you can send us an email, thesocialistshelf@gmail.com. If you want to be really ambitious and send in like a voice memo, then maybe we can like put that in there. I don't know. I can't commit for Ryan, but I'm sure we could do something with that.
Hey everybody, Editing Ryan here. Yes, if you would like to hear your voice on the Socialist Shelf, feel free to send to that same email a voice memo or an audio recording with your question or comment. Of course, if you would rather hear it read in one of Jacob or Lenore's lovely voices, send it in as a regular email per usual, but we would love to hear from all of you and especially your lovely voices. Back to Jacob.
But please shoot us an email. Let us know what the show's meant to you, something you want to know, something that you think is funny related to the show. Rate the books we've done. I don't care. Send us an email. We want to hear from you. 100 episodes, folks. It's been a lot of fun.
Listening to Socialist Shelf Radio.
You open your eyes at dawn and turn in the cool bed sheets. A few feet above your head, affixed to the top of the roof, a layer of solar panels blinks in the morning sun. Their power mixes with electricity pulled from several clean energy sources, towering wind turbines to the east, small nuclear power plants to the north, deep geothermal wells to the south. 40 years ago, your parents cooled their bedrooms with jewels dredged out of coal mines and oil pits. They mined rocks and burned them, coating their lungs in the byproducts. They encased their world, your world, in a chemical heat trap. Today, that seems barbaric. You live in a cocoon of energy so clean it barely leaves a carbon trace, and so cheap you can scarcely find it on your monthly bill. The year is 2050.
No, it's not. That happened to me this morning.
Yeah.
I woke up in a cocoon of energy this morning, but that's just like my aura.
Yeah, you've been farming nonstop. It's pretty concerning, actually.
It's super cool. I'm hoarding it. That's why no one else has an abundance. It's because I'm hoarding the aura.
Yeah, but we've, 25 years, a lot can happen. Get cracking.
I'll start spreading it around eventually. Maybe the year before this, so we can make Klein's vision come to life.
We just need massive aura subsidies from the U.S. government and get big balls on that.
Welcome to the Socialist Shelf, here for all your aura needs, to give you an abundance of aura. It's me, Jacob, here with Lenore. We're here to talk about this book, Abundance, that I just kept hearing about over and fucking over again. And then it turns out, oh, wow, the Democratic Party is making a caucus over this, and they're bringing Ezra Klein in to talk to leadership. And, like, this is actually going to be a thing we're hearing about a lot. So unlike Hillbilly Elegy, where we got to it, years late, let's get up ahead of this thing before people are doing the retrospective on why the Democrats lost 2028.
Yes. Perhaps, perhaps there'll be this episode cited in Jacobin and whatever publication also savaged Hillbilly Elegy. Not to get ahead of ourselves. I don't know how rigorous this is going to be, but you don't have to be a dirty commie like us to read over this and think there's something not right here.
It's interesting because unlike something like Hillbilly Elegy or something like that, this is written from a liberal, not just a liberal, but a very progressive liberal perspective. Abundance is a work by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. These two guys are very progressive. They're very sympathetic even to like Bernie Sanders and AOC. I believe they both align themselves with Warren in the 2020 primaries, but still they're amenable to a lot of progressive policy. And these are guys who genuinely want a future that is, I mean, according to them, inclusive for people of different races, different genders, etc., sexualities. There are contradictions that comes in that when you go past America's borders, how they feel about certain things. But this is not, the ravings of reactionaries, nor is it completely unfounded on any kind of concept or logic. We'll get into it. It's interesting, though, because what makes this book so fascinating to me is you can have these two very smart guys, and we'll get into their education, with good beliefs. And because they are just, so liberal brained, so article brained, they can write this thing at the top about how by 2050, you're going to live for basically free in a Manhattan skyrise. And there's going to be, they say, we didn't get to this part, but low orbit Ozempic factories that are delivered to you via drone, and all the energy is zero cost, and all your meat is grown from cells. There's no factory farms. And there's still like bird scooters on the ground and like lime scooters.
The future is lime.
Right. And we haven't fundamentally changed the political system at all. We just did this by invention. And it's like that's as absurd and stupid and just
it's as fanciful as thinking there could be a socialist revolution tomorrow.
It's as fanciful as thinking I don't know, that true allegiance is also how the country works. This isn't how the world works. So I'm interested in hearing or figuring out why these guys that I think are actually quite smart are able to, due to like liberal delusion, land in a place like this.
Well, and you mentioned marginalized people, of course, outside of the borders of this country in the global South, who are the engine for much of, global manufacturing at this stage. Ezra Klein and Mr. Thompson really don't. There's allusions perhaps to the movements of the 50s and 60s, but in a very sort of perfunctory manner.
Yes. Before we get into these guys and the book itself, let me tell you the fundamental premise, if you haven't picked up on it already. Abundance. The idea is liberalism in its current incarnation has failed. Okay, well, me and Lenore can get behind that. And so if we want a new direction, it can't be just the neoliberal consensus, and we can't just replay the hits. We need a new idea. The Democratic Party just got our ass kicked, speaking from their perspective. Donald Trump is managing to be like the most powerful man in the country. What's going on? Why is nothing working? We need a new liberalism. We need a liberalism that builds. That's the last line of the book. The idea is, what if we took some of those ideas, like New Deal ideas about, building and providing for people and competing, he divorces it from some of the context, but whatever. And we apply it to the challenges of the 21st century. And we do that by cutting red tape, cutting regulation, spending a lot of money on infrastructure, and doing private-public partnerships.
Yes, for all he talks about environmental regulations being the sole bugbear holding back home construction.
And zoning, Lenore, zoning.
Oh yeah, no, clearly he's read The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. No, when he started talking about environmental deregulation, just, popping off about that, I did a quick Control F through the book. East Palestine, Ohio is not mentioned once. Mm-hmm. Weird how that works, the wildfires in California and the hoarding of water and the electric companies there doing what they're doing. Not a single mention. It's just red tape, as you say.
It's a lot of red tape. And what this is fundamentally, and you'll soon see why, is this is a terminal case of a disease that Lenore and I discovered called article brain. It is a disease that's actually been ravaging the Democratic Party for a long time. It's mostly confined to liberals because you do have to be able to read to contract it. But leftists can get it too. Don't get me wrong. There are plenty of socialists with article brain. I have certainly I've certainly had article brain from time to time. Not casting the first stone here, but unfortunately, this is maybe a case of terminal article brain that has created this book. Lenore, can you think of any way that we could possibly cure this, or is this terminal? Will the Democratic Party die of article brain?
I mean, I think the answer is just to supply and demand. Just
Mm.
continue infinitely funding research and medicine, and eventually we'll come up with a vaccine for it. Operation Warp Speed 2, perhaps. That's the only material barrier.
Well, the good news is because the biggest discovery of the last century is AI, large language models can now produce endless articles, and it doesn't matter if they're good. It's supply side economics for articles.
Yeah, you just gotta grok that shit and maybe eat a couple of rocks while you're at it.
Grok that shit is so good. Who out here
Uh,
grokking your shit?
I, I
Um,
I don't want to get too cinema sinsy on this, but like this stood out to me early on. Of course, Ezra Klein here is making the point very early that luxury goods versus education, right? The price is out of whack. There are very skewed profit incentives to the extent that he ever gets into the profit motive in this book. And he has a quote here. In the 1960s, it was possible to attend a 4-year college debt-free, but impossible to purchase a flat screen television. Again, I know what he's saying. The point he's trying to make is clear, but he's so obsessed, very James Patterson like, with really, or Thomas Friedman like, indeed, with really punchy bon mots, that he steps face first onto this rake. They hadn't been invented yet, flat screen TVs in the 1960s.
if FDR was so good, Lenore, why was Nintendo Switch not guaranteed in the New Deal? Chicken in every pot, sure, but what about a
Where is
Switch in every?
FDR 2?
Yeah, what about a Switch in every gamer chair? No one's talking about this. You know what I am going to talk about though? I'm going to talk about Ezra Klein, and I'm going to talk about Derek Thompson. I'm going to talk about Derek Thompson first because I'm just going to be so real with you.
Ezra Klein is much smaller than Ezra Gross.
Derek Thompson is the figure I'm less interested in for multiple reasons. One is because I have more experience with Ezra Klein, reading his work, listening to his podcast. Basically, an entire summer, I listened through like most of his podcast catalog when I was delivering pizzas
Really?
because, yeah, well, and I'll tell you why. It was a period in my life where I was beginning to identify as a socialist, and I really wanted to make sure I wasn't, just a progressive Democrat, like a progressive liberal. Before I was like said the socially ostracizable thing of I am a revolutionary communist, which is, not always the easiest thing to say and to be. I was like, I'm going to look into like the smartest progressive liberals I can find. I listened to stuff from Chris Hayes. I read Bernie Sanders stuff. I listened to stuff from Ezra Klein. I read a lot of very smart academics. And I went through all of that. And I'm like, I appreciate these people. And they're also wrong about a lot. And I can tell you why. And so I am actually, that's also why I think Ezra Klein is a smart guy. I think I could have a conversation with him. I think he's probably a nice guy. I think he fundamentally wants good things. I can't say the same thing about a lot of like, his counterparts, but I do think that about them. I think he's also just wrong. He's got a terminal case of article brain and like liberal brain. But Derek Thompson, very similar, but kind of the lesser of the duo to me. Staff writer at The Atlantic. He was a triple major at Northwestern University of
Of
Journalism
course he fucking
and
was.
Political Science, which it's like, come on, man. Like, I I don't want to be toxic, but like, please get laid. I'm
I
sorry.
The school that I went there about the time that they finally stopped allowing people to triple major.
If just imagine someone saying, "Yeah, I'm a triple major in journalism, legal studies, and political science," like, oh god. He hosts the podcast Plain English, where he uses his expertise to quote cut through all the noise around big questions. End quote. Yada yada. He wrote that World Without Work article in 2015 that was like, what if AI tech makes us not have to work anymore? You remember all that? That was like a big kerfuffle online for like 2 weeks in 2015. Uh, it's good if you don't remember it. But
I what was I doing in 2015? Drinking a lot, probably.
fair enough. Well, Derek Thompson wrote that, and it was, whatever. It's fine. He has some interesting like questions he asks about will that free us under, current profit motive and stuff like that. But he's writing for the Atlantic. He can't get too radical with his opinions, and he clearly hasn't moved left since then. And if you need to know anything else about him, this is something that he tweeted mere months ago about Joe Biden. There's an extraordinary effort from alt-right commentators to claim that the legacy media lied to strategically cover up the issue of Biden's age and only suddenly covered the subject. It's fascinating to watch people I respect express this idea, and frankly jarring.
Yeah, such alt-right figures as Jake Tapper. Who else read that fucking book about the whole media effort to hide that Biden's brain was yogurt?
Yeah, alt-right figures such as George Clooney.
That's the other thing. Like, it's very
Rachel
funny.
Maddow.
Yeah, it's very funny. We were discussing this earlier, to have this book come out in the age of ICE stepping up its deportation targets, right? In
Right.
the age of Donald Trump enacting his new trade war, in the age of government moving very swiftly and forcefully in all the ways that it was claimed that it could not during the Biden years, and there's a lot of the theses of this book that are running pretty hard against the optimism of this book is that, like, we have the correct wonkery if only people could listen to our caucus about it. And as we said in Black Chamber, the benevolent ruling class that listens to the right ideas doesn't exist.
Right. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And these guys, both, especially Ezra Klein, had the ear of Obama, and they really had the ear of Joe Biden to the extent that Joe Biden can, process. Certainly the people making policy around Joe Biden, like, were reading Ezra Klein.
Mhm.
And that's where I get into Ezra Klein, who is more important and is, I think, going to play an increasingly important ideological role in the Democratic Party if things play out like they look like they're going to. Ezra Klein is from California. His dad's a mathematics professor. His mom's an artist. He graduated from UCLA with a political science degree. He was never a very good student, he always said. However, curious guy. Interested in politics, and so his first big job out of school, he moved to Vermont to work on Howard Dean's primary campaign.
Ah!
Howard Dean's primary campaign. Dean is, honestly, it makes sense because Dean's a numbers guy, a pretty, like, a smart political strategist, as in, like, Dean actually helped Obama a lot. And also the 06 midterms, like, he was really good at, like, flipping seats and doing the math and doing the polls. But of course he couldn't beat the raw charisma of powerhouse John Kerry and got defeated in the primaries in 2004. But that's where Ezra Klein broke in, and he starts blogging then. And because the year was 2004, you could just, like, post on the internet and have a career. If you figured out, like, how to, like, turn on the internet and, like, how to, like, pretend to have a website, you could just, like, become a blogger. And now everyone has to pretend like you're an expert. It's very frustrating.
Yeah, there were blogs, and then there were podcasts. Now I suppose there's Substacks.
How the cycle declines. But because of his blogging, he gets hired by the Washington Post as a writer. And then he starts working at the same time at MSNBC. And then he starts working at the same time at Bloomberg. So he is working at all three organizations at the same time. This dude is a workhorse, no doubt. In 2014, he leaves the Washington Post to form Vox, his brainchild.
Oh boy.
Vox is very much the brainchild of Ezra Klein. Vox is when this, like, the new media was all the hype. Articles are saying, oh, this is the same thing as a tech startup. And he puts together a dream team, including well-known genius and one of his best friends, Matt Iglesias.
Oh God. 1 billion Americans himself.
We might have to do that book at some point. It's kind of washed at this point, but that is a funny one. 1 billion Americans in this actually have a lot of shared DNA. His first ever article at Vox, Ezra Klein, and the first one ever, was How Politics Makes Us Stupid, asking how we got so damn polarized. And it's all just kind of like that. Like, Vox can be a useful resource, especially some of their explainers, their policy breakdowns. It has a very, like, kind of annoying millennial coreness to it. It describes on its website as like, we're like if a Wikipedia article was written about politics with a little snark. It's like, okay, cool. But like, it is sometimes useful. Like, I've definitely found Vox articles that are good. Like, I don't want to, downplay it. They made like 1 million Vox podcasts. There's so many Vox podcasts. They end up making a Vox TV show on Netflix called
Oh yeah, for all the
Klein.
Vox Populi.
What does the Vox say? It's a thing called Explained. Ezra Klein is a producer on it, and Ezra Klein makes the show In the Weeds and the Ezra Klein Show as spinoffs of this. Vox, according to their own metrics, they get like 20 million hits a month right now. Like, they're big. They do numbers. They claim that they want to be like incredibly centrist and like middle of the road. They're the most liberal to ever a liberal, and whatever. Wish they would just admit that that's just the case. But it's a big thing.
Yeah, they have a pretty hair-splitting article on like that, claiming to debunk that Princeton study that like the average person's vote has like very little impact on like public policy.
Yeah, it's it's a mixed bag for sure. He's got influence. Now, I think this is absurd, but GQ called him one of the 50 most powerful people in Washington, D.C. I don't think that's true, but that does give you a sense of like he does, again, have the ear of Democrats. Basically every Democrat that like can read reads him. So, that not Joe Biden or, potentially like John Fetterman, but the rest of them do. They are, I'm very mean today. I'm sorry. I'm angry. Life circumstances, okay? I'm in a bad mood. But it's okay. But anyway, so that's his deal. He's married to Annie Lowry, a economic writer at The Atlantic. It seems his entire social circles are people who write for The Atlantic.
It's all people who talk to each other. Have you
Yes.
noticed?
In fact, he got in trouble. Like, there was like a scandal in like the 2010 or so where it turned out he had made a chat room of like every single liberal blogger and writer, and it was just a chat room of them like talking shit about conservatives in their field and like full support. It's actually hilarious. If you read the leaked transcripts, they're so fucking funny.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah. No, I am no like stone-hearted cynic about this. You want to laugh about people on the right go wild.
Yeah, but like people like lost their jobs over that thing. It was so annoying. It was like a big like 2010. I can't believe the lack of like respectability. Like Ezra Klein like almost lost his job over like having a chat room. It was absurd. Little did they know the chat rooms conservatives were in. Uh, but full support for Ezra Klein on that one. But
Hmm. Yeah, no,
anyway,
critical support in many cases, not all of
so
them.
his beliefs, though his policy positions are like pretty like generally quite progressive. He has been on the left wing of the Democratic Party most of his life.
Yeah,
Uh,
he has some correct opinions about early on in his first chapter. Like he says a lot of good things about the market not funding socially necessary advancements on its own.
yeah.
Fine, that's true, but
Mm,
it's he really doesn't deal with the profit motive and the class interests of the people at the helm here, the Elon's Musk, if you will. That's the other thing that infuriates me. Elon Musk's name appears 3 times in this book, and he is described variously as, here we go, a walking advertisement for what public will and private genius can unlock when they work together. And later on, he calls him a vociferous critic of progressive policy, which is a real charitable way to describe a guy who believes in white genocide.
yeah.
It's very he's taking at face value a lot of things that have since been loudly debunked by the people he himself is talking about.
And to be clear, like this book is written like post Trump being elected, like
Hmm.
reelected. So like it's not like this was written 10 years ago. um Obviously there have been developments since, but still. Um I do have to know. because everyone who did this has to be called out for it. Ezra Klein did vocally support the Iraq War. He was fresh out of college when it happened. He was young, but like also, come on. He has since he has since walked back and he's written multiple articles about why it was stupid, why it was wrong. He even to his credit said it's not just wrong because we couldn't do it the right way. There was no right way to do it. Um, so, but like I feel like anyone who had any kind of public platform that used it to support that war should not ever go anywhere without that being noted.
The first thing you should do when you hear about a new commentator who's been in the game for a few decades, just Google their name and see what they were writing in the year 2003.
It should be like a sex offender registry. Like no matter what you've done,
Literally.
you still got to like go door to door in your new neighborhood and say, "Hi, I'm Ezra. Yes, I supported the Iraq War."
Somebody with like the fucking inglorious bastards like Iraqi flag tattooed on their
Right,
forehead.
right, for real. He's actually like I actually was kind of impressed with some of his other foreign policy record though. Like on like even like skeptical of like Libya intervention and things like that. I mean, that shouldn't be impressive, but given like the milieu he runs in, that's actually like he's certainly more skeptical on war. That said, read what he has to say about like Gaza and Israel and Palestine. It's all like, oh well, Netanyahu is just this like avatar of malice that somehow keeps magically winning elections in Israel.
Yeah, no analysis of the social base of Netanyahu. No analysis of the militarization of Israeli society writ large.
He did
Like
a
it's
real ridiculous discussion with the New York Times where he was like, "Do you think Sinwar has a plan to take over the world?"
oh yeah, and he's got a mountain base right next door to fucking where Bin Laden's used to be.
And then he was talking about he was like, talking about Iran. It's like, we shouldn't rush into a war with Iran, but at the same time, we should consider that like, oh, what a nuclear Iran would mean. He's a boring liberal until now, in which he becomes an interesting liberal because he wants abundance, Lenore. And we've talked enough about him. Lenore, I told the top a little bit what abundance is, but do you want to really give the people the core pitch of abundance so that they can join this new liberalism that builds?
Yeah, build more stuff, cut red tape, more housing, unlimited funds to research, to medicine, and like let a thousand. I think he actually says like let 1,000 enterprises bloom or some shit like that.
Neoliberalism is over. Now we're cutting red tape.
Yeah, like
It
like
sounds half of this shit sounds like something Ronald Reagan would say.
literally no, like he comes it's especially infuriating because like at the end of this intro section here, like he comes perilously close to diagnosing a crisis of overproduction. Right, we have a startling abundance of the goods that fill a house and a shortage of what's needed to build a good life. He says, we call for a correction. We are interested in production more than consumption. We believe what we can build is more important than what we can buy. But no jobs program, no hard look at building luxury condos instead of affordable housing. Like it's we'll get into it, but there's a lot of
Lenore, how good are you at doing a Slovenian accent?
oh god. I mean, you've fucking been to Slovenia recently. You should be
Yeah,
better.
I want to say pure ideology in the Zizek voice.
To our Slovenian audience, sir, I apologize.
If we have a Slovenian audience, your country was so cool, dude. Sorry about the 90s. Um that was our bad. Mostly. Margaret Thatcher played a role too. Anyway, so why I say pure ideology is because he even acknowledges in this book, I could have made this book a series of policy proposals and I didn't because. And the reason because is sure, it is good to paint a vision and to make an argument for policy. And it is also true that people don't want to pick up a book that is just policy. And to Ezra Klein's credit, I do think he's fully capable of writing policy. He's worked at think tanks or worked with think tanks that have. His show Into the Weeds really gets into the weeds. He's not lying. So again, I want to like pay respect to this guy's intelligence, which is also why I can then say, better, dude. And I say another reason that he is not concrete in his policy proposals in this book, because if he got any more concrete than what he puts in this book, then you would immediately start to run up against the limitations of the system. You would have to run into, well, nobody in power wants to do this. You would get comparisons to previous programs that have attempted it, and you would start to see suddenly why this isn't possible without everyone in the country reading this book and adopting it as their ideology, which is
Well,
not going to
yes.
happen.
Yes, and you bring up previous programs that have attempted this or that thing, and it puts me in mind of I had the pleasure recently of reading Alec Karakatsanis' book Propaganda, right? And so much of the narratives that sell police militarization, increased police budgets, the fiction that police keep us safe, revolve around the idea, the idea that's spread by $1 billion police PR industry, that previous attempts have been made to defund and to restrict and to, quote unquote, liberalize American policing. And that's led supposedly to a rise in crime, and thus, we need to fund the police more. And you have similar mythologies at play here regarding progressive, supposedly programs that have been put into practice and tried and failed, right? I'm thinking here of when he's talking about California and its homelessness problem. There have been many explanations offered for the severity of California's homelessness crisis. Perhaps it's the nice weather, which makes sleeping on the streets comfortable even in winter. That's a fucking ghoulish approach.
I guess comparatively to,
But then why is homelessness so much less prevalent in Houston, where the winters are yet warmer? Perhaps it's the generosity of California's social services. No mention of Newsom vetoing single-payer healthcare, of course.
Bruce and
Perhaps
Gavin, yeah.
Perhaps it's liberal drug and policing policies. No mention of the LAPD literally being a racist gang.
The
Perhaps it's
LAPD
something.
gangs, yeah.
Perhaps it's something to do with mental health. I refer you again to the vetoing of single-payer healthcare. Perhaps California is a magnet of social service compassion, attracting all the rest of the country's homeless.
Come the fuck on. I'm sorry. That made me so mad. I never mind.
But yeah, no, 100. I would, and I live in Atlanta. I know a little bit about the effort to quote unquote clean up the streets for the 1996 Olympics. I would be very interested when he diagnoses Houston as having sort of solved the homelessness problem with cheaper housing and no zoning restrictions. I would be very interested to see how the successive governments of Texas going back to about the 1990s have dealt with the homelessness problem, how they have perhaps shipped people out of the state. I don't have the hard data on it, but I suspect there's more at play here than simply making housing easier to build in a reactionary environment. And that's the thing here. Like Ezra Klein does, assumes that all these things will take place without a reckoning with the reactionary governments in control of these states. He assumes a much more robust federal government than we have seen, acting in a much more, Teddy Roosevelt black chamber sort of fashion, just sort of going, it's my way or the highway in terms of social services. And he doesn't engage at all, of course, with the basis of the wealth of our ruling class, which is unequal trade with the global South.
And we live in Atlanta, and housing is cheaper in Atlanta than it is in LA. It doesn't feel cheaper to those of us who live here. It feels pretty difficult, but it is. Didn't stop the city of Atlanta from killing Cornelius Taylor a few months ago, homeless man sleeping outside Ebenezer Baptist Church because they were trying to clean up ahead of MLK Day. If you want to wrap your head around that. I'm not trying to get too bleak here. I'm just saying this is the actual lived reality on the streets when you get away from the wonkery. Speaking of the wonkery, because policy makes sense, and I there is some credibility to the fact that yes, housing shortages, and I actually would prefer the term housing inaccessibility, right? Because there are housing units open. Housing inaccessibility is one of, if not the primary driver of homelessness. It is true that people want to be in LA because of opportunities that an economy like LA affords, or because they grew up there, or whatever other cultural reason. And then the housing is too difficult to get. And so they end up homeless. A lot of them still work. There's actually a significant amount of working homeless people. And he is not wrong that, like, you can't just trace homelessness through mental illness. You can't just trace it through drugs. There's all this different kind of stuff like that. I get that. And it is probably true that there are parts of LA where it would be easier if there was more housing. But it is ultimately still true that there are more empty units than there are people that are sleeping on the street.
Oh yeah, housing construction has rebounded from 2008. Like, it's at an all-time high.
And also, I mean, like, it's just frustrating because this whole book talking about abundance, and I'm all for building stuff if we need it, but misses the point that we do have enough. And I know he makes the argument that we shouldn't just redistribute the pie, we should invent new things. And that's true. I agree we should invent new things. But, like, we don't need to invent, 4 walls and a roof. We've got that. And we've got more than enough of it throughout the country. And we've got more than enough of it in the vast majority of cities.
The problem is over a third of single-family home purchases last year were by private equity firms speculating on this stuff.
Yes. And it is true. Like, I concede, of course, that places like LA, and I appreciate him calling out that places like LA will say Black Lives Matter and then gentrify, right? But gentrification doesn't happen because of red tape. Gentrification doesn't happen because of, because we don't have an abundance mindset. Gentrification happens because of, obviously individual people's racism, of course, but also because things get more expensive, and things get more expensive because capital and the profit motive is allowed to drive housing. And at no point in this book, he dances around it here and there saying, well, public housing can be good. But he doesn't just say, we should make housing a human right, which is what we could do. We could say, fuck everything, fuck cost, fuck if we need to build, we'll build. If we need to rezone, we'll rezone. And if we need to straight up take empty units, we'll take empty units. And guess what? That last one is going to be by far the most efficient.
Oh yeah.
It's true. There are probably places where we could build more like high rises. Sure. Okay, cool. But the fundamental problem is when those high rises get built, if people can't pay to live there, then they won't get filled. And so what's the point of building them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is I opined in the podcast chat that this might be our like recommending party books episode, because if you want a vision of a reconstruction, of a radical revolution in society, read Socialist Reconstruction from the party. Like it actually reckons with
Reconstruction by the Party for Socialism and Liberation. You can buy it at Liberation Store. We'll link it in the episode. You can get it from 1804 Books. Presents a vision of what a socialist United States can look like. And actually there is shared DNA between it and this book. It does say, let's build, let's invent, let's grow, but it identifies the culprits. And the culprit is not that we're playing musical chairs with 10 people and 9 chairs. We're playing musical chairs with 10 people and 10,000 chairs. And one guy has 9,900, however, 99% of the chairs. That's the problem.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and on the subject of, it's in the climate change section that he kind of tips his hand a little in terms of who he talks to and who he's very credulous about. Like, he can't resist mentioning his venture capitalist buddies' vertical farming startups. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, it happens.
Yeah, it's an idea that doesn't really take into account it really doesn't take into account the sheer scale of the energy needed to power one of those things, in terms of the UV lights, in terms of the sprinklers. Like it's coupled with or rather, it's not coupled with a policy that demands a shift away from oil and gas. I mean, he talks frequently about the Biden administration passing the most ambitious sustainable energy plan in the history of the country. He doesn't talk about Biden opening up more drilling contracts than any other president before.
Yes and no. To give him his flowers, he does mention, though, that high gas prices stress people out so much that Kamala talked more about oil than she did and gas prices than she did about that energy investment. But you are right that he conveniently doesn't actually get into that drilling. It is interesting too how he rightfully notes that green energy has become remarkably cheaper, like way more than we really even expected. He doesn't give proper credit to China for that.
I was about to say he takes a sweet time talking about. He takes a sweet time to get around to how China has built more solar than any other country in the world.
Or that they're the reason primarily why solar has become so much cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
But he doesn't get into, okay, so why are we still drilling gas? Not really. Why are we still doing oil, right? Because if capitalism functioned the way we all think it's supposed to, then it is just a matter of what's cheaper. He doesn't get into, there are entrenched interests, there are a ruling class, and that particular ruling class that we have now needs that fossil fuel. It needs that oil because that is where a lot of its money comes from. There is an inertia there. It's not just a matter of what makes you more money, right? Not that there can't be green capitalism, right? There are plenty of capitalists who are making money off green energy. There are capitalists who have a vision of a zero emission capitalism, but the inertia of the American ruling class is, a lot of that is because they have vested interest in fossil fuel, because they are not willing to let there be stranded assets. This has actually made me think very much about Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future. He kind of gets into some of this stuff very effectively.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a whole episode on that, so I won't go into that at length. But there is an actual, it's not just a matter of, oh, the American public doesn't have the will for gas prices to go up.
Not that he doesn't speak in those essentialisms, right? He has a lot to say about how Americans speak about this. Americans talk like conservatives but want to be governed by liberals. Why? Why? Do you not draw any conclusions from people wanting improvements in their material conditions, but not understanding the role of a state in providing them? And indeed, like he talks elsewhere in the book about particularly the right wing of government providing a very anti-state sort of messaging, and liberals not really providing any counter messaging to that. But he doesn't really bridge the gap, in my estimation. Although he certainly says that, yeah, we need more robust state investment in this.
I also think it's interesting who he decides to call out in this chapter.
Oh, are you going to talk about Jason Hickel?
Unfortunately, because and I'm going to be real, I don't know that much about Jason Hickel. Have you read this degrowth book that he keeps referencing?
No, I follow Hickel on socials. I respect what he puts out.
Yeah, no disrespect to Hickel or anything like that. We're not here to unpack the degrowth movement. Maybe we'll have an episode on it. I also follow Hickel on social, but here's what I'll say: is he spends this chapter contending with the degrowth movement. And that is not actually a legitimate force within the Democratic Party or liberalism or really anywhere. That is a thing about if you spend 10 hours a day on Twitter, like I have in the past.
Yes.
I know about it because I'm terminally online. I'm telling you, I'm recovering from article brain. I've listened to every one of this guy's podcasts he had put out up to the year 2017 or 2018 or whenever it was. I'm not casting the first stone here, but I am telling you that this is not, for a book that is supposed to be, here's what Democrats Project 2029 needs to be. Your average voter in a swing state does not know what degrowth means. They do not know who Jason Hickel is. When you say, oh, this movement is trying to trade the animism of our ancestors for Christianity's promise of dominion over nature, the problem is not simply greenhouse gas emissions or microplastics for them. It is Cartesian dualism and American-style capitalism and everything these systems of thought and practice have taught us to value and prize and want. That is not only just such a bizarre misrepresentation of anybody who I've ever encountered's opinion, right? That we should get rid of Cartesian dualism and that American-style capitalism is entirely behind the concept of burning fossil fuels. But it is also just, you're arguing with no one that matters.
It's article brain, as you say. It's getting very, very into the weeds of the superstructure of the ideology sort of undergirding all of this. Without getting into the materiality of what's driving it.
Let me correct myself really quickly before you go on. I'm not to say that Hickel doesn't matter or none of his work has any value, but I'm saying within the coalition he is speaking to, because this book is explicitly targeting the Democratic Party and future Democratic voters. So yeah, to be clear, I don't want to dismiss this entire whatever field. That's an entirely different conversation. Sorry, just realized that that could be heard a different way than I meant it. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries, no worries. But yeah, he takes his environment in which he is, only talking to other consultants and article people that
His friends all work for the Atlantic.
yeah, and he's basing his assumptions about what people care about on that, right? He says, no less than housing, climate change makes a hash of our traditional political categories. Here it is typically the right that is willing to leap into the unknown, confident that humanity can adapt to unimaginable change. As Ryan said, where's the Republican great leap forward? Here it is largely the left that wants to conserve the climate that the entirety of human civilization has known. Again, he's getting into some borderline anarcho-primitivism critique here, because it's certainly true. Again, go read Tina Landis, Climate Solutions Beyond Capitalism, right? It is certainly true that the contours of our agricultural practices have to change. It's true, it's true that profit motives have driven massive increases in methane, how they've driven, inhumane factory farming practices, all this, that, the other. Our answer is not to go back to hunting and gathering. Our answer is not to,
Well, the answer is not to regress, right? Like when Engels is writing about the origins of capitalism in the family and he refers to primitive communism, he is not saying, therefore, that is our model. He is pointing out that people lived in community sharing alike at one point in history, and we have the capacity to do it again, but this time with vaccines and nuclear power and planes and shit. And that's awesome. He didn't know about those things, but I'm saying that. You know what I mean?
And
That's awesome. Share that shit.
And the way that he puts it, this was infuriating to me. Hickel compares the scale of the philosophical and economic revolution degrowth imagines, Klein says, to Darwin persuading the world of evolution or Copernicus spreading the knowledge that the Earth revolves around the sun. He envisions a wholesale shift in humanity's relationship to other living things and to itself, but shifts of that size take decades or centuries to play out. In the case of evolution, the victory is yet only partial. We do not have decades or centuries to convince the world to act on climate change. And first of all, it's very, very funny that he uses the "we don't have decades or centuries to convince the world to act on climate change" to argue against the smashing of old institutions and the building of revolutionary new ones that could carry that out. Right? His argument is, okay, well, we need to elect people who believe in this or that ambitious policy while still preserving a profit motive. But B, he goes on, to the extent that degrowth has a specific climate plan, it is to shut off or scale down areas of production it deems destructive, like military investment, meat and dairy production, advertising, and fast fashion. There is some appeal to this. All of us can identify some aspect of the global production system that seems wasteful, unnecessary, or harmful. The problem is that few of us identify the same aspects of the global production system. And I was waiting for him to defend the military, right? On what grounds does he suggest that military investment shouldn't be reduced? And he doesn't. He doesn't touch it at all, even though the Pentagon is one of the biggest polluters in the country.
And to his credit,
in the
if
world.
you get into the weeds of what he believes, he does think that we should cut military spending. Not by the amount that you or I believe we should. He does believe that we should shut down some military spending. But if it was very, very core to what he believed, he would talk about it in this fucking book. And he doesn't. He doesn't touch on it. He doesn't get into it. I don't know if he says the word military in this book. If he does, it's just in the context of World War II production. And again, I don't want to misrepresent his positions. I'm sure if you asked him, he would be like, yeah, we should retract the military budget by X amount and whatever. He's an Elizabeth Warren guy, right? It's just how these people talk.
I have a plan for that.
Yes, yeah. Big structural Bailey is back. He's in the room with us. He's bringing us. You need an abundance to feed Big Structural Bailey.
Well, and again, just to get back to this book coming out at. It seems exactly the wrong time, for itself. It's extremely funny that he says, well, you can't pass a global or multinational tax on meat to deal with this stuff. Extremely funny in the age of the tariff.
Exactly right. Fuck, you can't. It's interesting. I was in a discussion the other day, and someone made the point that Donald Trump has proved that you can pass policies that crash the global economy and still be the president. And I know that sounds silly, but it's like, and yeah, his policies were bad and stupid. And we don't have to get into all of that. But like sometimes if a policy is worth doing, like you can carry it out and Wall Street can fucking deal with it. And
Yeah.
obviously Trump didn't have the guns to do that. He didn't but like it is possible and the world keeps going and we still have all the stuff, right? Like nothing goes anywhere. There is a reason that when the entire global economy crashed in 2008, China went down a little bit, but they ultimately were like, yo, we still have the factories. These houses, we still have these. The cars, we still have them. The roads, the infrastructure, all of it, none of it disappeared. None of it turned into smoke. If this was an economic recession caused by, I don't know, like all our factories burning up, then that might be one thing, but it's not. It's the same reason that during the Great Depression, yes, they were going through challenges, but the Soviet Union was the only major country in the world that continued to grow because they had direct power over their economy. That's not to say every decision they made in the period in the 1930s was correct, but it was not subject to the capriciousness of global capitalism. And Donald Trump, ironically enough, has proven that there is state capacity to just continue through these things.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that, yeah, you could just pass this shit unilaterally if you wanted to. And Joe Biden could have done anything he wanted, both with Congress because he had both houses, both himself because he had all this power. When he came into power, he actually had a massive mandate. Like he won by a fuck ton. And here's the thing. He could have done anything he wanted to, so we should assume that he did do what he wanted.
Well, and you now have Democratic politicians on that side of the aisle, right, saying outright that, yeah, any one of us could force a debate, could force a floor vote, could slow down and delay anything that we want, and basically hold the entire government hostage, be the Tea Party to the left, let's say, the Justice Democrats describe themselves as. Any one of them could do that in pursuit of whatever legislation they wanted to.
And they would be a hero. They would win every election for the rest of their lives doing that too, to be clear.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and so it's very funny to me that he tries to square that circle, right? He tries to say, well, Democrats took the anti-austerity lessons of 2008 into the COVID era and funded the biggest expansion of the welfare state in this country, and he doesn't get into the aftermath of it, right? He doesn't get into the systematic dismantling of it, which they midwifed into. They like to talk about that. Yeah, the child tax credit saw a 50% reduction in child poverty, and then what did they do? They let it expire. And granted, by that time they lost control of the House, control of the Senate. Doesn't matter. If you have a Lyndon Baines Johnson figure in office, you can get a lot done. If you have people in Congress who are willing to hold the government hostage, shoot the hostages, Kyle Kalinske says, I used to listen to him a lot. You can get a lot more done than he likes to imagine. And the book, again, not to misrepresent Ezra Klein, I haven't listened to him as much as you had, but the book seems bereft of imagination for all the vision that it claims to have.
And I also think it should be noted that you're talking about this COVID stuff. It's part of the reason that Donald Trump was able to make some gains among poor people. I'll tell you why. And I know this because I've talked to people, because I've spent time on the streets talking to people about politics, because it's part of what I do with organizing. Some of the only experience with social democracy that people have ever had in this country were under Donald Trump. And that's not because Donald Trump wanted to pass it. And I know that's not fair. And I know all of it. But in 2020, those checks that people were getting were in the eviction moratorium that people experienced. And yes, every asterisk in the world. I know not everyone got that. I didn't get that. Okay. So don't come for me. But for a lot of people, the only experience with any kind of social democracy that they've ever properly had was under Donald Trump. But this book frustrates me so much because it identifies a lot of the problems. It identifies that liberalism is without direction. It identifies that the United States is a declining empire that's obsessed with consumerism. And it basically says we need to build more and consume more. And it doesn't have a proper answer. And then it just yada yadas it away and says, don't worry, Star Trek is coming. No, it's not. No, it's fucking not. Not without the Bell riots, not without the fucking uprisings. Like, it's just not going to.
Oh, that is something that irks me. Like he arrogates to liberals, to Democrats, the advances that organizing brought, the advances that the
Mhm.
civil rights movement and the gay rights movement and all the other movements of the 50s and the 60s and 70s and the Great Depression before that. He arrogates to liberals all that. He says, for decades, American liberalism has measured its successes in how near it could come to the social welfare system of Denmark. Liberals fought for expansions of health insurance and paid vacation leave and paid sick days and a heftier earned income tax credit and expanded child tax credit and decent retirement benefits. Worthy causes all, but those victories could be won when they were won largely inside the tax code and the regulatory state. Building a social insurance program does occasionally require new buildings, but it rarely requires that many of them. This was and is a liberalism that changed the world through the writing of the new rules and the moving about of money. Nothing about the longshoremen's strike in the 1930s. Nothing about the Watts riots. Like it obfuscates just how much just how much of the Democratic Party, which again, he's going back before the sort of like Southern switch sort of thing. Like he obfuscates just how much of both parties was devoted to resisting these advances until they became too untenable to resist.
Also, bullshit the Democratic Party is trying to turn us into Denmark. Like, 4 Democrats.
It's a very funny contention to, and you don't even have to go back to the 50s or the 60s or the 70s to do that. I mean, fucking when Stacey Abrams was running for governor the last time in this state, part of her platform was increasing police salaries.
Yeah. No, there's like half a dozen national Democrats that would be comfortable saying we should have social services that are the same as Denmark's.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, that's as far left as you can get in the party, and they'll still torpedo your presidential campaign. That is on a roll because of it. They would rather lose a national election than have that even in the conversation. So, like, that's also not true. And Ezra Klein does absolutely know better than that. I also just think it's interesting getting into, and this gets into the housing, this gets into the invention, that gets into all of it, this discussion around red tape. And he uses an example, a fair example, because it is true, a real failure of California failing to build high-speed rail. They approved it, they put aside the money for it, they started working, and he's talking about all this red tape. He's talking about all these regulations, all these failures, all this and that. And to an extent, it is true. Like, we know for a fact that the government is not a monolithic entity. It is an overlapping set of different institutions,
No,
state.
it's a monolithic entity. It's one hive mind. I just talked to it the other day.
Okay, cool. Never mind. We'll tell it to get on high-speed rail. And it represents different ruling class interests and different individual politicians' interests. And there is real red tape, no doubt. And he's talking about, high-speed rail. He's talking about trying to build energy. And he says, for example, talking about building energy, installing wind and solar capacity isn't just a manufacturing challenge, it's a political one. Wind and solar require far more land than coal or natural gas to produce the same amount of energy. Some of the viable land is open and easy to purchase, much of it isn't. Neighbors have fears about a wind farm rising near their homes, and communities have concerns about becoming the site of a major solar array. If the land is publicly owned, the project has to negotiate with an overlapping set of federal and state authorities. It can take years merely to get the plans and permits approved. And he goes on, and there is some legitimate stuff here, right? If this was a policy book and it got down to it and said, okay, so here's how we reform our laws, that's one thing. But on a broad scale, what this tells me as a reader is not, okay, we need to reframe the Democratic Party around cutting red tape. What this tells me is this is a government that has grown bloated and huge off imperial spoils. We are at the end of a cycle of the growth of an empire. We are declining. The shit that worked for us once is catching up with us. And ultimately, we may be able to fix individual things, right? A great lift of work can maybe build a solar project here or construct a bridge there. He really jacks off Governor Josh Shapiro for being able to build one bridge. But ultimately, this thing is broken. This thing is not going to work. This is a fundamentally broken system that is not prepared to deal with the challenges of the 21st century, specifically climate change. And capitalism has not just outlived its usefulness, it is at a stage of unbelievable decadence. And when you ask me, how do we cut through all this bullshit through these regulations on federal land that the government owns? Like, sorry, climate Stalin, I guess. Because like I don't know, I like what else do you want?
Well, and the government is perfectly willing to waive such laws where necessary. I mean, he talks about Trump's border wall. Fun fact, Biden's administration also waived environmental laws to keep building that thing over the objections of environmental groups, of Native American groups, of, it's extremely frustrating to suggest that it's red tape that's the problem when a lot of this stuff is simply a lot of the money is owed to ourselves, figuratively. A lot of the laws aren't fucking real. The crux of his argument is so vibes based, it makes my blood boil. Here in chapter 3, govern. Let me see. It is tempting to say that with these essentials already in existence, he's discussing specifically medical advancements and whatnot, it is time for society to focus at last only on the fair distribution of existing resources rather than the creation of new ideas. But this would be worse than a failure of imagination. It would be a kind of generational theft. When we claim the world cannot improve, we are stealing from the future something invaluable, which is the possibility of progress. Without that possibility, progressive politics is dead. Politics itself becomes a mere smash and grab war over scarce goods, where one man's win implies another man's loss. And again, he's doing the backwards arguing like we don't have decades or centuries to do this thing, to argue against doing the very thing that we need to do, which is building new institutions. He's setting up a false dichotomy, a false adversariality between distribution of existing resources and creation of new ideas, right? That's it, and why, right? He's using this paragraph here to directly argue against, as you said, Elon Musk owning 99,999 out of 10,000 shares. We need a smash and grab war over this concentration of capital that's taken place. We need to nationalize energy. We need to nationalize housing and take it out of the hands of private equity. And it's extremely infuriating to see that just kind of dismissed, right? Because you would have to go knocking on Peter Thiel's door with a very large stick. You would have to take the toys away from his venture capitalist buddies.
And I think also what he misses, and he has moments where he touches on a mass movement, and I know he has a conception that this book will start a new mentality in people. But yes, like things like climate change will require massive infrastructure programs to meet. And what you need for that is a lot of workers, right? And the difference in just the idea that, oh, this is going to be jobs, right, in some kind of abstract, that'll be popular sense, is I think the way we look at this is not just this is jobs, but this is an army of workers conscious of what's going on. That this is what we need, is an army of workers conscious of what is going on, and they are integrated properly with a state that knows what's going on, a state with the capacity to act out the will of the people. And when those workers build the bridges, build the wind turbines, build the nuclear power and the electricity and all of it, they electrify the grid. When they do that, they are self-consciously acting out the will of the people as part of a political project, as, executors of the people's vision, the necessity of carrying out the future. And that is something that they're not really able to do. At the end of the day, even when he proposes something good, like clean energy, right? It is, oh, well, we can have a carrot and stick approach with multiple corporations that are bidding on it, and hopefully we can have union labor. And it's like, no, like, think bigger, right? And he identifies that there are other models for this, right? He talks about, more organized groups you have, the more infighting there will be. He says, Affluent, stable societies have more negotiations, and that means they have more negotiators. There's great good in that. It means people's concerns can be voiced, their needs can be met, their ideas can be integrated, their insights can be shared. It also means that it becomes difficult to get much of anything done. This is why China can build tens of thousands of miles of high-speed rail in the time it takes California to fail to build hundreds of miles of high-speed rail. China does not spend years debating with judges over whether it needs to move a storage facility. That power leads to abuse and imperiousness. It also leads to high-speed rail. I didn't
Again,
write that. Ezra Klein just wrote that.
yeah, again, like no mention of East Palestine. We famously don't have environmental abuses here in this country. I'm speaking facetiously, of course. Like it's extremely revealing, I think, to read this book and to see what he considers an abuse and what he doesn't, right? He considers abuse in China breaks on the ability of their capitalist class to follow, to follow profit motives and market trends. And it's infuriating because he says that like the market isn't the most efficient allocator of resources. Like he says, the state has to pick winners and losers. That's what China is doing. The four biggest banks in the world are Chinese state-run banks
Right.
that can be directed to invest in these things. And it's all while he's misrepresenting class consciousness as this false maximalism that opposes innovation, right? He's very anxious, I think, and again, you see it in his treatment of Elon Musk to the degree that it even exists, right? He reads government subsidies to Musk's companies as progressive policy, right? When he says Elon Musk is a vociferous critic of progressive policy, right? He reads government subsidies to his companies as progressive policy, which is extremely funny to me, considering that he's a contractor for the Defense Department and the intelligence community to decidedly anti-progressive things, especially if you live in the global south, right? You read Elon Musk's name in this book, in the 3 times it appears, you do not know about his labor violations, his racism, his fascism, his eugenics, his sexism. If you only read this book, you assume that the problem with the world is that your ambitious, clear-eyed John Galt's are restricting from doing what needs to be done.
I'll talk a little bit more about the John Galt's thing in a second because I want to get into the invention section. But I wanted to say one more thing on this.
God, we're going to have to read Rand at some point, aren't we?
You have to read Rand. He says, liberalism has become obsessed with procedure rather than with outcomes. It seeks legitimacy through rule following rather than through the enactment of the public's will. Homelessness in Los Angeles is a catastrophe. The public is furious at the sluggish and effective response, and the lead agency on homelessness is spending its time filling out audit forms and making sure each dollar is spent in strict accordance with the specific demands of funders, right? So for me, I think when I read that, I'm like, yeah, you're right. Let's smash liberalism, right? Let's get a state that is linked up with the people, a state that is the workers, right? The people that will build the housing, if we need the housing, will be the workers, the people the state serves. And the state will identify the will of the people. In this case, we've all identified that we want homelessness dealt with. We don't want there to be people sleeping on the streets. The vast majority of people in this country would say they want those people to be in homes. Only a very small subsection of freaks would say otherwise. And then the state moves and makes it happen. And there are moments where that is bumpy, and there are moments where that is tough. And there are moments where that bumps up against interests, specifically the capitalist interest, which is why you need a socialist workers state, right? Not a capitalist state. But when he talks about all these interests fighting, it is very rarely the interests of the people, building the housing, the people, living on the streets or wanting to live. He is empathetic to the people who need housing, sure, but their political interests or their political power, the conception that the workers have any political power is not there. It is all the interests of the homeowners association. So at the lowest rung of power is, homeowners in Los Angeles. That is like that's the poorest person like that has political power, all the way up to the billionaires. it is cut off. The vast majority of the population is under the level of consideration of having power beyond the vote.
Well, and he steps perilously close to that analysis, right? Especially, and I don't hate the medicine chapter, right, where he talks
Yeah, and
about
we can kind of get into that. We
yeah,
were going
well,
to get into that next, so yeah, bring us into that.
yeah, where he talks about the mRNA vaccine not producing returns early on, similar to the to penicillin needing what he calls micro inventions, little advancements here and there to make it practicable at scale, right? Like he talks about the woman who spearheaded like the invention of mRNA vaccines, Miss Kariko from Hungary.
Catalan, an abundance of Catalans. Is that
Yeah,
anything?
no, he very correctly talks about that. Yeah, these, sometimes like these things need to be moonshots. They need to have funding in order to make them practical because they're not practical at first. Now he doesn't really get into her ability to stay on at UPenn, which was tied to her ability to generate value. I mean, he kind of does, but like that's the thing. He correctly diagnoses that there are political breaks on scientific research. True enough. But he conflates it frequently with political abuse of regulations to argue for throwing out regulations entirely, right?
Right.
And that's the thing. There are shortages some places in housing. There are abundances elsewhere. I don't dispute that case by case these things need different approaches. But he's throwing the baby out with the recycled bathwater used to cool nuclear reactors.
It's interesting, and you are right. I am sympathetic to some of what is happening.
No
In the,
private company could orchestrate the national production of penicillin in World War II, so OSRD did it. Office of Strategic Research and Development. No private companies were close to putting a man on the moon in the 1960s, so NASA did it. I mean, this is all true.
yes, this is all true. And him talking about, oh, this woman's research was ignored over and over. I think there was also probably an element of sexism there. If I had to guess, I've read a little bit from this woman, but
Mm. It's,
neither
al-
here nor there.
it's also
Uh,
very, very easy to say that that Operation Warp Speed saved more lives than the Manhattan Project because the Manhattan Project did not save lives.
Yeah, that was interesting. But he makes a good point that there is ways the government can do very impressive things. Operation Warp Speed, which, if you don't know, created the COVID vaccine, is an incredibly impressive,
I
and
think
it's
that
impressive.
10 months to develop a vaccine that would have taken years.
And who is it impressive because of? It is impressive because of women like this who were born poor and worked their ass off studying, working class people. It is impressive because of the people in the lab. It is impressive because of the people who put together the needles. It is impressive because of the people who drove these around in refrigerated conditions and because of the pharmacists and doctors and nurses who administered the shots. It is not impressive to me that some politician signed a check. It's not impressive to me that Moderna and Pfizer exist and their CEOs made the money on it. That sure, cool. And I think that they were still like missing, the point that there is a working class that has needs. And yes, it needs to be shaped and driven by a government, a working class government. But the way you solve these issues of modernity is not by these like weird private public partnerships. And like he doesn't really go into what else happened with the vaccine. Like the level of conspiracy and the level of like the way in that the United States, we talked about it last week, started throwing out, conspiracy theories about other countries' vaccines to undermine China and denied, yes, it was good that the United States made the vaccine easy to get in the United States. It also like allowed other countries to basically be blackmailed for like mineral and water rights
Sent
over the
millions of expired vaccines to countries in the global south.
yeah. So it's frustrating and but it is true. Like there's a lot of research that goes undone, and I think that we should acknowledge that that is more because of profitability, though. That is more because of if we were just trying to discover and to grow, we wouldn't be limited by a crisis of profitability or things like that. Um,
Yeah,
and in fact, we could save a lot of money if we just like cut out the shit that's actually costing the most money in things like healthcare, which is the insurance companies, the weird patchwork of pharmaceutical companies. I mean, I know Ezra Klein supports universal health care, but he doesn't even go so far as to say there should be universal health care in this fucking book.
Hmm. Hmm. No, yeah, it's a lot of magic beans getting sold here. A little later on, like he says, if we eventually hit it big with carbon vacuuming machines that save the world from climate change, it might very
Fuck
well be due to
off.
policies that guarantee a return for the best early technologies. And it's like, yeah, Ezra, and if we don't, the world fucking ends.
Right. And I agree. Let's research carbon capture. Someone pulls that off, that's awesome. I mean, like, just like we should have researched the COVID vaccine the second that COVID dropped. Sure, research carbon capture. Go for it. Also, though, let's not count on it. What we can count on is carbon capture like trees. I don't mean this to be the Jack Off China episode, but guess what China is doing? Planting a shit ton of trees. And they give a lot of people jobs doing that don't have a lot of great prospects.
Fucking Burkina Faso planted trees. Much smaller, much poorer country.
By the millions.
Yeah, that punched well above its weight for its population and for its GDP. And this was in the 1970s.
You want to talk about, job programs, you want to talk about meaningful work, things like that. That's a thing that this misses, is that ultimately a lot of the abundance it talks about, despite it saying this isn't all about cheap consumer goods, it is still chasing that like ideal capitalist lifestyle. It is still chasing, we can live a life of super consumption if we make more. It is still at the top, giving you a vision of your nice apartment where you're being delivered things by drones and you're eating food and everything's fucking cheap for you and you don't have to work particularly hard. It is not painting a vision of like an actual societal goal. It's not even suggesting that, in fighting climate change, we reimagine our relationship to the earth or anything like that. It is ultimately thinking like through policy, and not even policy it spells out particularly well. We can solve the contradictions. And anytime he acknowledges plans to the contrary, anytime he acknowledges, China, for example, he'll just say, yeah, it's working, but at what cost? And then he doesn't say the cost. He'll acknowledge the concept of degrowth. He'll misrepresent it as far as I can tell. And then he'll just say like, and we don't have time for all that. It's very frustrating, if you can't tell. I'm very frustrated. And I want to be excited by a lot of this stuff. I want to be excited by building green energy. I want to be excited by inventing new vaccines. That shit's cool. But this isn't going to work. This isn't going to work.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
I want to be excited by, because there are use cases absolutely for AI, right? For artificial intelligence, automating a lot of the drudgery away. And he can't help but mention it in the same breath as ChatGPT, right?
Right.
Very, I don't know. It's been a frustrating week in many ways. But thankfully the book is quite short. It's a lot of honestly, like the most infuriating bits of it, like quite apart from the ideology, is just the prose, right? It's a whole lot of gobbledygook. Like the unsolved problems are typically harder than the solved ones. It's
so true. I like this. I like this a lot. Where he's talking about, politics. This isn't his conclusion. They're split in their view of speech and history and decency and truth. Distinguished scholars write books considering the nearness of another civil war and wondering whether fascism is resurgent on American soil. The polarization of the 90s feels quaint against the chasmic conflict of the 2020s. These divisions are real. They are dangerous. But behind them is the murky outline of something very different. Perhaps a path out of the morass we're in, a new political order. The term political order is the coinage of Gary. Like, come on! You can't... It's like dramatic and also wants to read like a fucking term paper.
She put her luggage on the scale. This made her think of Gary Gerstle, an American historian and a professor at Cambridge University.
It is just so article-brained. It is just the most article book I've ever read. Also, like, I don't know where to fit this in, but it compares the Soviets launching Sputnik to a catastrophe equal to COVID.
I will defend that a little bit, not because the Soviet Union launching Sputnik was a catastrophe. I mean, if anything, a country just 30 years removed from a ruinous civil war launching shit into space should be more studied, and I wish somebody like Ezra Klein would do a little more reading on it, certainly. But like from the perspective of a government obsessed with the threat of a good example, with a geopolitical rival doing socialism and not capitalism, sure, this would seem like a disaster that spurs, great innovation. But he doesn't really drill down into the why of it, right? He doesn't really drill down into how much of, our ruling class's policies are a response to that good example, to another country diverting state resources into the general uplift of its population. It's so much of the welfare state, of the expansions of Medicare, of Medicaid, of civil rights, were driven by the fact that the Soviet Union could point at us and say, this is a country that treats African diplomats like animals. They are barbarians, and we're not perfect, but we're at least providing a minimal standard of living, and creating a country where our various formerly prison housed nations can work together for mutual benefit. China has no more extreme poverty. Why aren't we talking more about that?
I like in the last chapter, he also references Marx, and he's like, Marx would agree with me, by the way. He was like, I don't like him, but you don't need to be a communist to see that Marx would think I'm cool.
It's weird and a little bit, we're not going to get into his misrepresentation of Marx and Hickel and others on the, actual left. But like, it is interesting to me that he kind of pays lip service to those ideas without really seriously engaging with them. It seems to me like a way for, I don't know who this is for, right?
It's for the people on Twitter. It's for like rose emoji people on Twitter.
Yeah,
like I'm serious. That's who this is for.
It's for
Conrad Waluigi on Twitter.
Yeah. And for maybe the so-called intellectuals on the right to point at this guy and say, see, he agrees on some points with Marx. He's a communist, like because everybody to their left is a fucking communist.
That's true. Everyone has to be a communist if they're to the left of Donald Trump now. I don't make the rules.
Yeah, we'll get around to it.
But I mean, he acknowledges that Marx says capitalism is extremely productive and we can make it better. But that's different than what he's saying.
Yeah, fighting for reform under the system is very, very different than the ultimate goal of smashing it.
It's interesting, though, right? It is interesting that he is able to say Marx did talk about seizing things and directing them in a positive direction. And he does have to acknowledge that China is kicking our ass. And he is, at certain points, talking about history, forced to acknowledge certain successful models of the Soviet Union that the Soviet Union had, all its failings aside. But like that full thing isn't brought together to contend with, that there is actually an alternative, and it's not an alternate liberalism, it is an alternative to liberalism. But of course, like that would require breaking with the Democratic Party and breaking with American politics altogether. But I'll say this. Before you get Ezra Klein's vision of the Democratic Party, you'll get caucuses, right? You'll get lip service. Before you get a Democratic Party that actually pursues the vision of this book, which fair is fair, would be better than the Democratic Party you have now. But let's say before you get that, and before you get that as like a ruling coalition that actually pulls something off in this country, it would be genuinely easier to have a socialist revolution. And it is not easy. It's not easy to have a socialist revolution. It would be easier to have a socialist revolution than bring about the world from this book under the context of current American capitalism.
Just look at what they did to David Hogg just recently, right? Of course, we have our disagreements and opposition.
Not the Hogg.
Yeah,
Get him wrong.
We have our disagreements and opposition with Hogg. Of course, he signal boosts Pelosi and Richie Torres and Hakeem
Jeffries. He's a radical.
David
Hogg, famous radical leftist Marxist anarcho-primitivist.
But because he's younger and he has the audacity to say, hey, we need new people in office rather than people who are dismissive of anybody who's younger than them or doesn't kiss the ring for their various political dynasties. take a hike. Like, for the audacity of saying we need new blood in the party, even somebody who's as beholden to corporations as this person is forced out. And on what grounds? On like some weird procedural like gender diversity thing, which the right can point to and say, see, like they're doing like DEIA and like hamstringing themselves because they're too woke. And it's not even that. It's a very cynical sort of calculation that manages to piss everybody off.
So I'm not psyched myself, I gotta say.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Lenore, don't worry, because I'm gonna read you something that'll make you feel better. We seek a politics of abundance that delivers real marvels in the real world. We want more homes and more energy, more cures and more construction. This is a story that must be built out of bricks and steel and solar panels and transmission lines, not just words. It's a story, and we believe it is truer to the American character and experience, truer to both what we have done and what we will do than the narrow narrative of scarcity that has taken hold. Abundance contains within it a bigness that befits the American project. It is the promise of not just more, but more of what matters. It is a commitment to the endless work of institutional renewal. It is a recognition that technology is at the heart of progress and always has been. It is a determination to align our collective genius with the needs of both the planet and each other. Abundance is liberalism, yes, but more than that, it is a liberalism that builds.
I mean, you want to explain to me what the American character and experience is? Like, I mean, the ideas are the ideas of our society are the ideas of its ruling class. If you want to change the ideas, change the ruling class.
Well, look, Lenore, the story is not going to be built out of words. But words are pretty important, which is why Ezra has probably written 100 articles since we sat down to record this podcast.
And we'll be reading them all in the course of the rest of the year.
We're having the Socialist Shelf spinoff series, which is like Talking Talk Tua, but just us responding to Ezra Klein. Speaking of which, Talking Talk Tua, please have me on the pod. How much talk?
She's back. Did you see?
I know, that's Talking Talk Tua is talking about it. It's a great podcast because, you know, you got to listen to Talk to Her, but you also got to listen to Talking Talk to Her because they really break it down.
I tried to listen to Talk to Her. Like, I got about 20 minutes in and then I threw in the towel.
Lenore, I hate to tell you this, but Talking to Her is a story truer to the American character and experience.
You know what? I'll buy it. You know, I mean, there is something to there is something to everybody wanting their 15 minutes of fame. There is something to content creation being one of the last bastions of creativity that has relatively low barriers to entry. You know, and I Haley Welch, come on the pod. I would genuinely love to shoot the shit with you.
I would love Haley Welch to be on the pod. Haley, I will fight for you to be our climate Stalin. I'm so serious. If you think you can do it, you already have the funds. I know you got hella crypto money now. I support you stealing money.
That poor girl. That wasn't her fault.
I support you stealing money from the stupidest people alive. That was correct. I don't care whether you did it on purpose or not. If you did it on purpose, that makes me like you more. And I will absolutely talk to it with you. I don't want to talk about Ezra Klein anymore. If you can't tell. I suggested this. This isn't Lenore's fault. This is all on me.
Yes, this is your revenge for Black Chamber, isn't it?
I guess I want to say at the end here that, like, there is no one that frustrates me more than someone that I know knows better and I know wants something good for the world, like genuinely somewhere, like has a genuinely good vision of the world in some capacity, but is so over intellectualized and so overthought it and has absorbed so much ruling class ideology and just bullshit that they cannot see past their own article brain. I'll just make that the most said term on any podcast ever on this one. And that's why Ezra Klein frustrates me so much, because, like, I know this guy is brilliant. He's so smart if you listen to him talk. He really is, genuinely. I do not say that about most, like, political thinkers that I disagree with. I think he's probably a genuinely good guy. I think he's probably very nice. And I know that he could know better. And instead, he's writing this shit. And now we're going to have to fucking hear about it. And we're going to have to hear Pete Buttigieg in 2028 on the debate stage with Mecca Donald Trump saying, "Oh, we're going to fight the abundance agenda while Trump wants to, I don't.
And then Trump just calls him Stinky Pete and it's over.
Yeah, Pete is going to say, we want the abundance agenda, while Putin is Trump's frienda. And then Trump is going to just like shoot him. And that'll be it. It's over.
God, I hate that you're right. I fucking hate that.
Vladimir Putin's not even going to be president of Russia anymore. Like, it's not even going to matter.
Yeah, he's just gonna be prime minister again, and it'll be some other dude.
Anyway, all I have to say is, like, the reason we talk about this is not to randomly dunk on someone, but because this is a emerging trend of the Democratic Party that I think we're going to actually have to, on the left, contend with to some capacity, because it does have a vision of the future, which, like, that's good. You should have that. Kamala ran without one, so, you need that. But we have to contend with a vision of the future that cannot come to be, because this is false and it's hollow. And the only way there can be abundance is to, one, acknowledge that we already have more than enough. And all that we make and we produce should be done by pooling the resources of society and democratically deciding, okay, how do we give people what they need from the pool we already have? And now where do we want to go next? And yes, it'll be invention. And yes, it'll be green energy. And it'll be the coolest shit you've ever seen. It's completely possible. And it's not going to come from the fucking Elon Musk model of government wonders.
From the Elon Musk model that is the very smash and grab war over scarce goods that Ezra Klein claims politics is not. One tranche of people, one class is doing this, one class is not, and once enough of us wake up to that, it's over.
Abundance? What is this? Twerking?
I hate you.
Abundance. Have a good one, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to Socialist Shelf Radio.